Hi, my name is Hunter Jones, and I'm presenting on the scoreboard, Performance and the Gender Gap. So the article I've selected is Expanding the Gap, an updated look into the sex differences in running performance conducted in 2022. In this study, we look at the sex gap in performance between men and women's world record times, and then also the top 20 athletes over the last 20 years. So background, there's some terminology considerations we have to make. Sex and gender in athletic domains are largely synonymous. So men's sports mean male category, women's sports mean female category. And sports are usually separated based on sex and not gender identity. So we need to be aware of that. So I've linked this article here that discusses that. So what is the sex gap or the gender gap? This refers to the differences between men and women in the performance of physical activity, sport, and sporting events. So this is usually displayed as a percentage, and it used to be called the gender gap, but nowadays we call it the sex gap. So drawing on the course material, we look at sociology of gender and sport article, and we see how there's inequalities in women's sports and the male domination and the social contexts of these. So this directly links to my paper, which is largely biological, but it also has some socio-cultural context in there. We can also look at storying the gender binary in sport, and this looks at transgender and gender non-conforming athletes and their exclusion and discrimination in sports. Now, I linked this article to my study for the fact that it fails to recognize transgender and gender non-conforming athletes. So we'll see that throughout the study. Okay, now into the introduction. Back in the day, there was a lot more discrimination and a larger gap in performance between the sexes before 1972. And then Title IX was introduced in the United States, which gave women more equality in sports. We can see that the average was around 17% across time, with a 30% gap, which was the largest in 1922, but it sits around 10.7 on average today. The primary explanation in the past has been that it is purely attributed to biological or physiological differences between the sexes. So this study will look at whether this gap remains stable and if there are other explanations for this. So the world record analysis takes two studies. It looks at one that looks at the 20th century and then the sex gap in 2004 for the other one. And then the conductors of this current research looks at the 2021 gap and then compares them. And so what they find is that some results show relatively stable sex gaps, whereas others show an increase in the sex gap. But there was a slight increase in the overall sex gap according to these studies in the comparison. Now let's look at the top 20 analysis here. We look at 8 events again. So there they are. And then we compare the top 20 athletes of each event per sex group over the last 20 years. So the first place of a specific event, first place male, is compared with the first place female, second place with second place, and so on and so forth. And we see this gap and we average it out. So the results show very little change between the 100 and 200 meter gap, and a slight increase in the 400 meter, but nothing too significant. In the middle distance, we see relatively no change with the 800 and a slight decrease in the 1500 gap. And then when it comes to long distance, we see a shrinking of the gap in the 5000 meter, and the 10,000 meter historically has had the highest gap, but it's become relatively stable. And then marathons doesn't show any reliable results, and so therefore it is quite stable. So for men and women, they show different results. Men have similar times to one another in the top 20, whereas women's top 20 are a lot more volatile and variable in their results. Now let's move to the discussion. At least historically, the sex gap was explained through biological components, meaning that it was all based on biology and no other factor played into it. But this study looks at how it is multifactorial and that there are socio-cultural factors that do play into the sex gap. So we can see the physiological discussion on this, how men have a better VO2 max overall and organs to support that. They got more muscle fibers, higher bone density, and organs that are larger and more capable of running at higher performances than women. We can also see that men have specific training regimens that are built for their body because there's been more research on men's sports. Surprisingly, women in long distance races outperform their expected results, meaning they're probably training at a more efficient rate. Now let's look at a sociocultural discussion. Legislation changes in the country you live influence access to sports and opportunities to sports, similar to Title IX. A lack of funding, revenue, and attention also has negative implications on women in sports. Stereotypes and discrimination continue to be an issue, which makes sports unsafe, inaccessible, and decreases participation overall. On a good note, there is more participation in women's sports because there is more access to opportunities. So let's relate back to the course. Looking back at sociology of sport and gender, we can see consequences of the sex gap, where we get these disparities in media attention, resource allocation, and overall profit from these sports for women. There's also a gap in research, which we saw in the physiological discussion, where men are better equipped with training regimens that complement their body type. And we also see that it is more than biology, that the gap is only partially explained by biology. Although it is a majority, there are sociological factors that play into this that are not biological. We can also look at Paul Willis, who is a prominent figure in the article, and he talks about hegemonic masculinity, where sports reinforce that and afford men opportunities over women. And this study partially supports that idea because it supports a binary system and shows that men biologically are superior in build when it comes to certain sporting events. He also discusses superiority complex, where male superiority over women in sports is attributed to biology, which is also partially supported by this study. But the study also pushes back and says that there are other factors that play into why women perform a certain way and increase the sex gap. Now, if we look at storing the gender binary in sports, we see a glaring problem because this article looks at transgender and gender nonconforming individuals and their struggle with the binary system. The major conflict arises when we have the study that really supports the binary system, showing evidence for the necessity of it. But it doesn't provide a solution. It doesn't say what we should do with these individuals who do not fit this binary. Okay, so now some final thoughts. The study looked at the sex gap in elite sports and the world records. We can see that this study links to the articles in this week's course content, and we can see how biological factors play into this sex gap. We can also see how sociological factors attribute to some of this sex gap and the shrinking and narrowing of it. But it also can widen it. We can see the support for the binary system throughout this study. Although it is not explicit, it does indicate implicitly that it supports a binary system and shows the reason for it. So we need to look at further progress in the future to see how sports and sex and gender fit into those and ways we can improve and create more equal opportunities for all. So now to my questions. Do you think that there are benefits to separating sports based on sex? Any cons? Where do you think transgender and gender non-conforming individuals fit within a binary system? Should we create a third category for them? Should we instead separate sports based on physical characteristics such as height, weight, muscle mass, etc., rather than based on sex? And then fourth, should feminism advocate for sex/gender segregation in sports, or should we eliminate those categories altogether and have everybody play in the same category? And then here are my references. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in class. Goodbye.